Hello everyone, welcome back to Hindsight. I'm Vani from Kalari Capital and I'm really delighted today to host Aayush Agarwal. Most of you have probably used or at least heard of Snabbit, India's first quick service app for on demand home services. It's kind of like all of us were waiting for it forever, and Ayush, of course, solved this problem. After Zepto, I think he chose to build in a far more fragmented and far more trust required category. Services is never easy to build, but in a very short period of time, I think Snabbit has done a great job in what was a very high demand but underserved everyday problem. I'm excited to speak with Ayush and understand the choices he made so that we can all learn from him today. Welcome,
Thanks for
Ayush.
having me. Thanks for having me.
Ayush, companies many times go through a pivot. There is an initial hypothesis, and then as you jump into the market, you learn so many things. So, that journey, I think there's a lot to learn from each founder. So, what was your initial hypothesis? What remained intact? And what has evolved with time for you?
Yeah. So I think just talking about how I landed up here, it was when I was leaving my last job and I thought that, okay, it's time, it's a good time to become an entrepreneur, solve a problem. This category was kind of at the intersection of a deep personal pain point. As a bachelor in Pawai, I was used to using at least two, three apps for everything I needed, except for this, where I really did not get any digital solve. So I think that was one part, and the other part was that I spent a couple of years at Zepto, so I had a good understanding of how hyperlocal commerce operates and what the urban consumer today is looking for. So this category somewhere sat at the intersection of my understanding of the urban consumer, my understanding of hyperlocal commerce, and my problems as a bachelor boy living in Mumbai. And so I think the only thing that we got really correct was the category, that this is a problem. This is a broken experience, and something needs to be built here which can basically digitize and add convenience and accessibility to this model. In a world where you can get married online, in a world where you can buy a car online, there is no way in which you can get someone to clean your home. And that bewildered me, right? So point number one is that it was this is how I landed up at the category, and probably the only thing that actually proved out was the correct choice. Just like any other entrepreneur or anyone else who's finding a solve to a problem, I went around speaking to both the demand and the supply side. So I spoke to customers and I spoke to experts. And I think when we started with multiple different hypotheses. So we started a subscription business, we started an on-demand business, we started an instant business. So we said that we'll provide house helps in all formats. And I still remember I had a small, hall, 1 BHK homes in Bombay are particularly crammed. But within my hall, there were 10 people, 10 experts that I somehow got on board, convinced them. And I would dispatch them from within my society and my neighboring societies, and I'd have them do jobs. And I think those 30 days were the most important 30 days in getting to where we've eventually gotten. So the biggest pivot that we had to make was that a subscription business does not work in this category. And I think that was one very important decision we took very early on, which changed the entire category. All the work that was done in this category before Snabbit was done in the subscription business. So everyone, and then this is a very important learning which I would like to talk about, is that we've always been taught, listen to the consumer, right? Go and talk to consumers. Times the consumer will actually lead you down the wrong path, because it's not the consumer's job to imagine the future. I'll give you giving you a very important, important example. When we went and spoke to consumers, hey, what's your problem? They said, look, we don't know where to find these house helps. We don't know how to manage them. They take a lot of leaves, etc. Okay, so what do you want? We want someone to come in every day. We don't have a house help. Typically, every founder or every person wanting to solve this problem will go and say that let me build a subscription business because the consumer needs this person every day, right? And I think that is the fundamental mistake everyone before us made, and we also made for 30 days. It's only after those 30 days I realized that this business won't scale because of very, very structural constraints around the thin margins, disintermediation, and typically how customer expectations change when you go from a single unit being transacted to a long-term transaction, right? Where the I would say consistency cannot be guaranteed. Like an expert could leave your platform any day, right? What do you do with the customer? The customer is upset. And that's why I think the wedge that we drove was that absenteeism is the problem we'll solve. But no customer really asked for it. So I think, we did a bunch of pivots, but the biggest learning I had is that while we should always listen to consumers, it is not their job to imagine the future. It's our job to crystallize what they're saying and actually find a problem worth solving, which is actually solvable, instead of blindly just following what a customer is saying in those early days.
How much did you consult mom?
I think, see, my mom was a very important inspiration because when I was living in Mumbai, I basically used to ask my mom to fly down every time my house help ran away. So I had no clarity. She lives in Calcutta, and I literally had no clue how to find a house help. So I would tell my mom, listen, my home's not clean for the last 4 days, and I don't know where to find a help, because the only way to find a help is, and the only way to find a help if you're a bachelor, right, if you're not well connected, is that at 6 a.m. you need to go down and do morning walks, and then you need to intercept everyone walking around and say that, hey, do you want to do a job? Literally, it's that how works. And I used to, my mom would fly down. She did it twice. So the deep personal pain point that I'm talking about was actually coming stemming from the fact that in a world where I can get food in 10 minutes and cab in 2 minutes, I'm literally asking my mom to come down, spending all the time, money, effort to actually just get someone to clean my home. Seems like a problem unsolved. So that's where my mom played a huge role.
And if you can really get a cab in 2 minutes, kudos to you. I can't. But let's talk about Snabbit, right? Now, when one of the things I feel in seeing so many companies succeed and so many not succeed is how the co founder team comes together. So, when you thought of Snabbit, what were the non negotiables for you in putting your teams together? And if you look back to then and now, how do you assess what you knew and what you didn't know about putting that early team together?
Yeah, I think so. I ended up founding Snabbit on my own, not because I wanted to, but because I didn't have a natural co founder. I think a natural co founder is a good way to have a co founder where you kind of think of the business together, you germinate the idea together, you have a personal equation, right? A lot of the great businesses that I've heard of, like, people just knew each other from way before, versus finding a co founder, which can, which I felt like the risk was very high because I wouldn't know the person very well, and in my understanding, getting the wrong person is worse than getting no one, right? So until you're really sure, just for the heck of getting a co-founder, don't get one. And to be honest, I've never written a line of code, and I was building in consumer internet, so I had to get founding engineers, right? And that was my early team. I'm very proud that both Hashmeet and Vineet, who joined us very early on as part of the founding team, and to solve for that one big requirement that I had zero clue about, are still part of the org, right? And doing phenomenally well. And I think the one thing I solved for over there was intent over anything else. So obviously you need a basic level of skill, understanding, and technical expertise. But I think the one thing that I was solving for at that point, or like I think maybe I didn't know I was solving for, but I somehow just ended up getting lucky, was that solve for intent. So when you are probably just building it from the grounds up, when you don't have the kind of brand or the kind of clarity along the way, people who are showing really high intent and people who are willing to back you at that point are the right ones to partner with, as opposed to someone who has a perfect resume or someone who has who's able to charm you over a discussion, etc. So I don't know if both my founding engineers were the best engineers. I don't know. I'm not the right person to judge, but I did know that they were, both of them actually started working before any commitment, right? Before, I know Hashmeet just took a train overnight, came down from Nasik to Bombay, and the first day that he was working, it was a Sunday, and I remember he left after I left from the office. That was his first day with no understanding of what we were doing. He just started building something. Like same with Vineet, right? When he came in, I think we signed the dotted line like 15 days later, but he had already shipped a couple of products by then. So I think solving for intent very early on is a very, very important thing, and not anything else. Like obviously you solve for hygiene in terms of like technical expertise, skill, etc. But just like mad intent is what is needed in those early days.
I agree. And it's lucky that you found great people in the founding team. You talked about starting out basically based on intent and trust, but sometimes there is need to have hard conversations. That could be, of course, our team members, that could be suppliers, that could be investors, it could be anybody. But inevitably, there are situations where we need to have hard conversations. So, what's your style, and do you procrastinate? Do you analyze? Do you take it head on? Are you impulsive? What are you in a style as a leader when you have to have hard conversations? And would you want to be something else?
Yeah, I think, see, obviously it's evolved quite a bit, right? And now that I have this, like, I always feel like if you look back at your former self 6 months back, you should at least have the feeling that you did so many things wrong, because that's just like growth, right? That's the only way to understand that you're constantly growing. So now if I look back at the conversations I probably had a couple of years back, I can understand so many things that were wrong with it, which is, it goes to say that probably, like, I'm wiser now, and I hope we're on this track. But my way of dealing with these things is that, see, that you have to take it head on. Like, I don't think there's an alternative, because if you're kicking the can down the hill, like, it really doesn't solve the problem. It just, I would say, delays it, right? And I think this is something I've learned the hard way. Like, so many times, leaders will realize uh, that there is a problem, or the first instance of understanding that something's off comes way before they actually accept it. So there's a lot of mental barriers that leaders go through before they actually come to accept the fact that yes, it's not working. Like, it could be with a very important hire that you made. It could be with an important project that you've launched, right? But you went ahead, you said that, hey, I'm going to build this large business, large category or vertical, or do this thing. But it's very difficult to go back to your investors, for example, and say it didn't work. And then you keep pulling it for like a couple of months until, like, you've spent more money. So all of that, like, obviously is something that I've learned in the hindsight. But I think it just boils down to being very genuine, very candid, and articulating really well, setting the right context, timing the conversation well, not from a point of view of procrastination, but from a point of view of, like, when do you want to do it, right? You shouldn't just like be impulsive about it, is what I feel. You should find time, you should find the right place, right? Some conversations, for example, happen very well when they're done outside the office, because like, you might just not want to do it in office. Setting context really well, trying to understand the other person, going in with a very, very open mind. Like, I've had difficult conversations with people in my team and walked out at times understanding that I was wrong, right? That's also happened. And I think then landing the message in the right way. So just like being able to have a lot of clarity of thought, sequencing everything in your mind, going very well prepared, and articulating yourself very well, and being open to feedback and hearing. So doing 60% of the talking and still taking 40% back and registering it. A lot of times people are nodding their head, but they're really not absorbing what the other person is saying, because it's just like a one-way conversation. So I think those things have just become clearer to me. But absolutely the approach, like, given that we're in the business of taking tough calls, like, and as the leader of the org, I need to keep doing that at a very high frequency. I think radical candor and taking conversations head on has always worked out as a, like, for me.
No, I like the word radical candor. It might be unpopular, but over time, I think there's a respect for that. Ayush, you're in a category or a problem that people can intuitively understand, but that's not always the case for all founders. And where it gets into a fix is trying to articulate TAM, SAM, some of these numbers, especially early in the company cycle. And in fact, personally, I don't think it needs to be something that founders need to overthink so much. But I often hear this question: how should I pitch the market opportunity, right? Like, should I make it so big? Should I make it too small? There's all these conundrums that founders struggle with. Did you think about that question at all, or you understood the problem intuitively and you didn't really look to characterize how large this opportunity could be or not?
So you're right. In our case, people related to the problem. A lot of people related to the problem. Surprisingly enough, some VCs don't, because, like, they don't face this problem. But I think so. I'll tell you what I've seen, right? And now we've kind of progressed from, like, raising early rounds to we've raised, like, enough capital along the way, and we've seen how the questions change. Early stage, we've realized, what I think is that the TAM question is not a number that people are looking for. So people don't talk about TAM and SAM. People talk about problem and vision, right? What is the problem you're solving, and how do you think that it will go ahead, right? I never got the sense that someone really wanted me to put a number onto it, right? How many million households, for example, how many micro markets? Those questions have become more important for us recently, right?
Today?
When people are now evaluating us from a different lens, people are saying that how big can this get? This will get big, but how large, right? For example, those questions come up, and that's when people want to do the maths. And by then, you just build enough conviction, you yourself understand. Like, today, if I were to walk you down the wallet share of a household on this category, and how that, like, for how many million households, how they're situated among the top 10 cities, and what part of it can be actually digitized. You can use consumer internet benchmarks. You can look at, like, global comparables. You could look at, like, the likes of Rapido and ride hailing, Blinkit and quick commerce, right? And draw multiple parallels. So all those Excel sheets work out at this stage. Early on, I think the right investor is really not, like, I've never been asked the TAM question. I've been asked, what problem are you solving? What's the unique insight? Where do you think it can land? And I must say that, I don't think people were asking me, people were evaluating me when I sold them on the vision. They wanted to think, they wanted to see how large can I think. I don't think they were trying to do the maths behind it. So I think the lens from which an early stage investor evaluates a business versus a late stage changes quite a bit. And it's the TAM question becomes more prominent in the late stage. You must know better, but this is my thought process.
No, no, I agree. I fully agree. And I think this is a nugget that's important for founders to understand different stages and not try to make the pitch deck too watertight that all these questions have to be ticked, right? You can still get funded, still be very successful without having to get caught up in the numbers game. You talked about solving this problem for yourself, but you saw that as a bachelor's problem in the beginning, at least. And I know today your customer base is far more diverse. But let's talk about your initial customers. How did you target those initial customers?
Yeah. So I think, see, it was a deep personal pain point before I decided to build a business. I think part of launching Snabbit was making sure that there's a diverse consumer base, right? The pop of idea was based on my problem, but I did not dive in until, like, I had validated it by talking to enough people around me. That's one. I think the first set of consumers for us, let me put it into stage one and stage two, right? So I would say the first 100 and then the first 1,000, right? Because I think these are the two very, very difficult sets. So I think the first 100 was, very honestly, I lived in a society which had 500 flats, right? It had like 500 1 BHK apartments in Hiranandani Gardens. At 4 a.m., I would, like, we printed out a pamphlet, we put some glue onto it, and at 4 a.m., like, I basically went door to door and hung those pamphlets. Got shouted at by the society association, but nevertheless still did it. And basically the next morning just sat in front of the phone. There was nothing. It was just like a phone number given, and waited for calls to come and messages to come and responded. And I think that is how we got our first 100 customers. In just two societies of Hiranandani Gardens, by sticking pamphlets, we actually snuck ourselves in to the other apartment. So we would actually, like, and I would actually book an Uber premium, because if you're sitting in a nice sedan car and entering, you don't get intercepted at the gate sometimes. So that's how I would sneak in at 10 p.m. into, like, the opposite building, and then go and stick those pamphlets, and then wait, like, the next morning for consumers to call us. And that's the only way in which I basically got the first 100 customers. So I think that is just about how hacky and how street smart can you get, right? I think that's the first 100. Do whatever it takes, right? Don't worry about it. I think the first 1,000 was, or the first 5,000 was about getting the playbook right. I think when you're solving for the first 1,000 customers, at that point the question to answer is that how can I solve for the next million customers based on what I do and what I learned. So for us, I think we would pioneer it, but we kind of, in a consumer internet business like ours, which is high frequency, hyperlocal marketing has not been leveraged to the extent that we did. I know a lot of, like, businesses like Big Basket have done really well, but we basically understood that digital marketing as a channel does not exist for a hyperlocal business, because you cannot really target a very small population. You have to run campaigns at the city level. So what we did was we leveraged society WhatsApp groups, and we basically started putting up stalls in every society to sell our service, right? And we gave the first service free. It's that at that point we understood who our TG was. We understood what is the pitch. We understood what makes customers trigger and make a purchase. I think all those things became clear when we were basically doing those hyperlocal activities. So I think that's like the first 100 and the first 1,000. First 100, just do whatever it takes, get whoever you can. Don't think of quality, don't think of anything. First 1,000, think of building a playbook which you can then replicate across. Because after that, you'll go away from the ground. Then you just need to, like, multiply, multiply, multiply.
So, you talked about playbook. You also much earlier talked about a realization or an insight that this is not a subscription business. So, how then did you arrive at what should your unit economics be, where ultimately this is a business that, even if thin margins or otherwise, you can be profitable? So how did you arrive at what the pricing strategy and unit economics ought to be?
Yeah. So, very honestly, I think for the first 1 year, we were not looking at unit economics. And I think one would make mistakes if they were, before they understand the problem they're solving, the customer they're servicing. How do you, for the first 1 year, which is 2024, way before this category even got built, right? And you will see our playbooks being used across the category now because but at that point of time, there was no on demand services platform. So at that point of time, the only focus we had was who is our customer, how do we reach out to them, what is the problem that we're solving, who is our expert, who's on the supply side, why will they stick on the platform, what is the win situation for them, why will this platform not get have disintermediation. So I think for 1 year it was just those things, right? Just finding product market fit, right? I think the economics only started, like, we started building our thesis on economics last year, and sometimes building it way too early could actually be incorrect. Like, for example, let me put it this way: that in grocery, for example, if you look at the unit economics, the grocers model works better, right? Because it's a pure marketplace, and you have someone else putting up the dark, like, store, and then you're just doing the logistics. And if you look at it from like, the naked eye, the dark store model is just much more operationally intensive, right? On day zero, because then you have to put the dark store, rent, all the facilities, inventory. So one could really take the wrong decision saying that the economics are much tougher in the latter category. But looks like that is what was needed for this whole consumer internet business to get built. So I think it's only when we found product market fit that we started looking at economics. Initially, we obviously knew that this category does not require capital because a few of the investments that any business has did not exist for us. Like for example, capex, working capital, inventory, right? Third party logistics, warehousing. None of those cost elements existed for us. So it was a demand supply matching business. Now, at what cost can you sell is something you learn iteratively by obviously, like, having different rate cards, working out with different sets of experts. How at what rate can you sell to the customer, and at what rate is the customer willing to buy is again an iterative understanding. And then how do you marry the two is basically the final part, because you have to pay what the expert is expecting or needs to make for them to be on the platform. With the customer also, you need to understand that, okay, fine, uh, how do I not be a very premium product for our kind of business, which is very frequency intensification heavy? And then we realize that, okay, 60% utilization is what we need to get to. Like, the model works at 60% utilization. So it was basically all about just combining demand and supply, and then saying that at what point does the economics work out? Which for us happened like much later, like last year mostly.
So you talked about, the what does the customer want, and all of that, of course, comes under the basket of customer experience. But did you think early on, here is what I want the customers to say about you, or was that a discovery and a evolution? So, how the customers articulate about you is what the real customer experience is, right? So how would you categorize that or characterize that?
I think for us, that's what I started with, right? The category was correct. Everything else we figured out. So when customers started using us, we asked them, why are you using us? So when I asked, like, a penny drop moment for me was, there was a customer who said that, hey, your subscription rates are very expensive. And they were like 100 rupees an hour, or like whatever, 120 rupees an hour. And my on demand rates were 180 rupees an hour. And then she said that, but your on demand rates are very cheap, right? I'm going to use your on demand service. I'm going to talk about it. So the same customer who was finding a subscription service which was actually cheaper per hour, right? She was finding it expensive. But the more expensive per hour service, which was a probably 3 or 4 times a month frequency, she was actually having higher propensity to pay for that. So when we spoke to consumers, we understood what they were using us for. That's when we understood, okay, there's rampant absenteeism amongst house helps. Each one of them take 3 to 4 days off. The pattern for this is very erratic. It's never planned well in advance. And at that point of time, customers don't have a solution. In fact, what customers were doing is, like, women in societies actually had society groups, and there's a term for it called badli wise, right? So they would actually text each other, and in friendly gestures, for homes that had their house helps coming, they would send them over to the homes where the house helps didn't go, or they would go down to the society watchman and talk about it. But I had zero clue when I was starting it, when I was starting Snabbit, that this is what was happening. So then we said that, okay, this is a very painful process to go through, especially when you're leaving for work or when you have to send your kids to school. If you were to just press a button and get someone at this point in time, it would be great. And that's how we said, that's our pitch. House help gone, snap it on. So I think that basically became our intro pitch. Staying close to consumers, talking to them, and going through every review, every feedback has genuinely helped us build our understanding. Not just early on, even like our thesis has evolved in the last 3 months, and even that is a function of just understanding how our power users are interacting with the platform. So I think we've always just the first set of customers we used to speak to, and you should just keep speaking to customers. And basis, once you speak to 100 customers, in your mind you will be able to understand that, okay, this is the story that is coming out, this is the problem that you're solving. You don't need to really put it down in excel sheets. Like, I do nothing of it. Like, I just talk to customers, and then 10 days later, while you're like, doing something else, there'll be a light bulb moment, and you'll understand, okay, this.
So, you've been phenomenally successful. You're highly articulate. It's a problem that's not a genius problem in the sense everybody knows about the problem, but you were able to create a solution and scale, which most nobody has done so far. So, was fundraising easy for you, hard for you, and what advice would you offer to other founders who are just starting out?
Yeah, I think so. I think for a tech disruption in our kind of business, it was very important that three things fell in line. The first thing was the right team, right? I think my time in building out Zepto really helped me understand hyperlocal nuances of a business, right? Like network design, for example, planning and demand planning, supply planning, for example, right? These kind of things I learned there. So I think that was really helpful. We also cracked the right supply chain, I guess, like, moving from pivoting from subscriptions to on demand very early, right? And third was capital, right? Being able to get that $1 million in within 30 days of incorporating the business, which allowed us to make mistakes. Like, I think that if I didn't have that capital, I would just, like, I would run out of capital because I bootstrapped it for the first few months, but I would run out of that capital very soon. And I could not have been able to be aggressively understand, like, being able to understand with aggression on the fact that what is really working, because you have to fail enough times, and failing does cost money. For me, I think it was a different route because I was part of the team that was fundraising in Zepto. So I think I still had some, like, I knew people in the ecosystem, and I was able to reach out to them and have them, like, they bet on me because they had interacted with me in Zepto. But I think so. It was, I would genuinely believe that it was slightly easier for me than for a lot of founders that I meet and interact with, and I understand why it gets difficult. I think that the tip or the suggestion I would have for early fundraising, and I learned it the hard way, by the way. Like, when I went out on day one, no one gave me money, but the advice I got was that go back and build the business. And I sat for 1 month and I built it out. And then when I went back with numbers that had to speak for themselves, I think it wasn't difficult. It got converted in 2 days. So I would say the early traction part, a lot of people today want to sell an idea and get capital.
Hmm.
Founders and entrepreneurs need to know that it's very rare, almost like there's a zero chance that you'll probably get capital in today's world on the basis of a paper idea. That only works for people who are very seasoned, very experienced, and have had a lot of success already, right? But for early entrepreneurs, if you have some traction, right, I don't think it's difficult to get capital in. But a lot of people just have an idea or have some semblance of what's working, right?
Hmm.
Like, if I go in with, like, 500 customers in this platform, I know that my retention cohorts and my frequency cohorts did the talking for itself. But if I try that in the first 30, I will try to raise capital and millions of dollars from top VCs, that's not going to happen. So my simple advice in the early stage would be try to get some traction. Do it in one micro market, do it in one city, one pin code. I don't know, whatever the smallest atomic unit of their business is, right? But once that is there, and once you run it for enough time so that there's repeat, for example, in a business that's repeat, or there's enough transaction value in a business that, like, has high transaction value, I think then it's so simple to just drop in a message, talk about your metrics, and someone will reach out for sure. If I meet a founder, I always say that, once you have traction, you tell me, you'll have all the connections in 24 hours. But let's get to traction.
So, can you talk a little bit about your women led fleet? Of course, we are in March and it is International Women's Day, but regardless, the women's led fleet, was it a deliberate choice or a accidental outcome? How did that come about?
So, yeah, I think there are two reasons for that. Okay. So, we're in the business of taking a category, moving a category from offline to online, right? We're basically doing an offline to online disruption. So, now think about what Uber did. Uber came in and said that there were a lot of, like, black cabs on the road. They said that, we'll digitize this entire experience. You press a button, someone pops up at your doorstep. Riders were primarily males at that point of time. So taking that entire cohort of people and moving them online is what probably Uber did, right? And using technology. For us, we were basically saying that let us create a very seamless, accessible house help experience for you because currently it's broken. So we worked with the current cohort of house helps, which was primarily women. So number one was that we were basically digitizing an experience, but the entire underlying cohort had to remain the same, right? Because they were the ones who were already going to homes and cleaning them. If I were to do drivers, I would probably be doing it with males because most of the drivers are males, right? If I had to build drivers as a category. So number one is that who is the natural or the offline category, how does it operate? And some nuances of that, if you try to break very early on, then you won't be able to build it. Like for example, the hyperlocal part, right? If we hadn't gone hyperlocal, we wouldn't have been able to build this business because if you look at your traditional house help, she will do a 1 hour job in one floor, then she'll move around to the next wing, then she'll move around to the next building, but within 100 meters she will finish all the chores, all the day's work. So if you create a 2 kilometer radius and give her build a business there, it won't work because the offline way of doing things has to some part of it has to be retained, and this is true for the cohort of supply you have as well. So that's point one. Point two is that 90% of our customers are females, end consumers,
Yeah.
right? 70% transactions are done by women. 20% are men booking in booking for their mothers, their wives, right, etc. So 90% of our end consumers are women, and women are just more comfortable when there's another lady coming in. So if you send and we obviously hear why can't we build it with a male uh, cohort, and we will at some point of time we will introduce males because there are some tasks that males can do better. Like for example, probably
In
climbing
the
onto a
fans
ladder,
or whatever.
using the fan,
Yeah.
right? So we will introduce that. But for a female at home who is actually our end consumer, she's just feeling safer when another female walks in, and that's a better association. And if at that point of time a male walks in, that might just make the lady uncomfortable. So I think these are the two reasons why we have an all women fleet. One, to obviously make sure that we're actually in the business of creating a marketplace, so we don't need to necessarily go and completely change the cohort of supply that exists. And number two, to make sure that our consumers are getting what they want, because a lot of consumers, 90% of them being female, are not really looking for a male to come home in the middle of the day and help them.
What's for you been the biggest surprise in the last 18 months, 2 years that you've been doing this, in scaling this rather? What's been the biggest surprise for you?
Okay, question. So I think in terms of what I've been positively surprised by is the fact that when we started building this category, right? And when I was at Zepto, we used to always we used to internally chat, but that it was also born out of a simple problem that there were groceries not available during the pandemic, and that's how they started the business. And today it looks like the modern way of consuming groceries. For us, we said that we are actually solving a problem, right? People are having problems with their house help. We didn't say that we are going to transform home services. We didn't even know how to do that. Today, when I look at this category being built, there are two deep insights. Number one, for a large cohort of our consumers, we're actually becoming the default option because the reason people needed a daily house help was people actually didn't need a daily house help. They just didn't have another option. In the offline world, everything is subscription first. So even if you need something twice a week, you'll still have to opt for like a daily subscription. But in the digitized online on demand world, for a lot of people, that choice exists, which actually influences behavior. And a very, very big chunk of your consumers actually move from subscription, which is typically rigid, right? And
Yeah.
requires upfront commitment, to a more
Yeah.
flexible, convenient option, which is on demand. And that behavior shift, honestly, I'm super surprised by. That's point number one. On the supply side, the biggest, and I'm extremely proud and happy about this, is that a big question that I always got asked was that uh, there's a supply problem. This is a supply first, this is a supply constrained market. And we actually thought this way for a long time until we actually realized that India has a very low women participation rate in the workforce, right? If you actually double click, you'll understand that in the society that we're talking about, like from which our experts come, they don't just have to work, they have to do a lot of other things, right? They have to take care of the kid, they have to take care of the in-laws, they have to take care of the husband, they have a lot of responsibilities. They have to take care of their health, which in a lot of times is like not very consistent, right? Which means that flexibility was a very, very important ingredient into increasing the workforce participation for these people. And the gig economy, one of the biggest tenets or attributes of the gig economy is flexibility. And we were the first ones to build, who are building the gig economy for women. So the 6 day work week, right, operates really well for the primary breadwinner, right, who no matter what happens has to go out and, earn a living for the family. But for the secondary breadwinners, flexibility is very, very important. And that was not existing, right? The gig economy for women did not exist. But that is what they were. One in two households today have no prior experience of doing.
I see.
And the only reason they're coming in the platform is because they can go on a 3 day leave and we won't ask a question. They can choose the days they want to work. Obviously, they can't like operate consistently at 40% attendance, but they can any day that they don't want to show up, they don't lose their job. They can choose hours and shifts which are as small as 4 hours. So a lot of early mothers, like young mothers who have their kids going to school, they can actually send their kids off to school, come and do a quick 4 hour job, go back before they come back. The kid comes back and earn 10,000 rupees a month, and that kind of augments the family income by roughly 40%. Gigifying the building the gig workforce for women will unlock an untapped supply pool waiting to be absorbed, right, but requiring flexibility was a very, very positive surprise. So that's why we don't think and we don't talk about supply being a constraint anymore.
Yeah, that's true. Of course, a lesson not just in that category of services-led economy, but of course, if you talk to women in corporates, that's their biggest challenge. How do I get flexibility to be able to balance work, right? So, one last question for you. You are a outlier in so many ways. You have a strong finance background and details of numbers and all come easier to you than to a typical founder who comes from a more technology background, right? So, when did this entrepreneurial bug and relevance to be relevant in a startup ecosystem actually click for you? Because a lot of people may feel that their background in finance limits them to be a founder, be a early participant in the startup world, so they usually think a tech guy will start a company. But in that sense, you open the path for many people to say, well, I can do it too. So what is special for you that allowed you to kind of, first it starts in your mind, I want to be a founder, I can do this. How was that trigger created for you?
See, I think it's a bit of an irrational decision. I think you need to be a little cuckoo to actually do it. Like I can give you very, very
Which most number says are not, right? You look at risk analysis,
yeah, like
all
if you do
that.
the math, like I was doing pretty well. Like for a 30-year-old, I
Yeah,
don't think I was doing decently, I would say. But
yeah.
something had to go wrong for me to say that no, no, I want to do this. I don't think what is your background in terms of education really eventually impacts what you do. And today, in today's world, where a lot of those tech elements are getting democratized, you can actually just use one of these tools to write code and build your own apps. It's actually getting simpler. I just think it's about having the conviction to solve problems, build something from scratch, be first principles. And for me, very honestly, I think I operated like I got operator experience at Zepto. Before that, I think it would be very difficult for me to imagine that I can actually look at different parts of the business. My previous role required me to visit warehouses, deliver orders, build category, like do all kinds of things and learn a lot. So I think that's what really helped me get to a point where I knew some of these things, and some of the myths had been busted for me in my previous job. Eventually, it just boils down to having conviction in yourself and saying that no one knows everything. You'll just figure it out along the way, and actually being a little crazy about it. Like you can't really take this decision in a rational mindset. Like if people tell me that they want to be entrepreneurs, I actually say that you shouldn't, because the only way you should still like it's only when you're not if me giving you advice can actually change your mind, you're not ready. If you go and do it despite me saying no, that's when probably you should become one, because it's not a rational decision to take, I can tell you that.
So who said A, go for it, and who was holding you back?
When I decided,
Yeah.
I think no one was holding me back. I think at that point of time when I had a word back at home, etc., I think there was enough support, and I think that's important, because you need to rework everything about your life, your priorities, for a very long period of time. So I'm glad that no one held me back. I like some people did, relatives especially, they think that this guy's gone mad because Zepto had become like
He's leaving
this.
a good job and yeah.
Yeah, he's leaving a good job. I think some of those things are very typical about Indian families, where people think that if you have a job abroad, or if you have a startup is doing really well, why are you leaving it and doing something starting up? But I think from my parents, like from my fiance who's now my wife, I think there was a lot of support. There was a lot of like, okay, go figure, we'll figure it out, it's okay, don't worry about anything else. And I think that's very important. Without that, it's very difficult to do it.
No, it's been fascinating to see your success and wish you the very best. And of course, you're in a category that feels like it has no bottom, right? So it's a very deep category. There are so many ways to continue to expand. And so I wish you the best.
Thank
Thank you
you.
for taking out the time and doing this, though. But I'll leave the last word to you if there is anything you would like to say.
No, I think it's been a crazy ride, and I think we're just getting started. Like you've mentioned that there's been a lot of success. I would say that's the only part where I disagree. I think we're just very remotely successful. We have a long way to go. We have a lot more to execute. We're very privileged, I would say, that we're getting the opportunity to build a business which solves for so many things at once, right? Which solves for the convenience seeking consumer, it solves for the dignity seeking expert, it solves for financial inclusion, it solves for a circular economy where real economic value is being created. And I think it's a very big responsibility that we have. And we take it very seriously. We think we're just 1% done. And I genuinely think that it's wrong for me or my team today to think we're successful. I think we've just gotten lucky with very large opportunity. And it's on us to make the most of it. And build it into a generational organization that can outlive all of us and continue to serve both our customers and our experts in a meaningful way.
To that, wish you the best, and we'll keep looking forward to your success.
Thank you so much, Vani. Lovely chatting with you.